Next up, we all know the story of April 19th, 1775, how General Gage sent troops to Lexington and Concord to disarm the militias of Middlesex County. We know the names of Hancock, Adams, and Revere. But the stories we're about to bring you are not so familiar, with names like Lamson and Estabrook, names that were almost completely erased from the annals of history.
Prince Estabrook was a slave. No question about that. Prince Estabrook was a slave for the Estabrook family. He worked for Benjamin Estabrook, was a slave owner.
By some accounts, African slaves had a presence on the soil of what is now America as early as 1502. But it wasn't until 1619 that African slaves arrived at the early colonial settlement of Jamestown. By 1775, more than 500,000 blacks, both enslaved and free, were living under the 13 colonies. The earliest slaves weren't just viewed as being inferior to whites. They were valued as little more than livestock. In legal matters, they possessed all the rights of cattle. In the mid-1700s, a growing anti-slavery movement from Europe spilled over into the colonies, and the role of blacks in America began to change. By the French and Indian War, although still enslaved and still considered inferior, men of color fought side by side with their white oppressors. And so it was on that first day of the American Revolution, blacks fighting side by side with whites.
There was not one slave, but there were about 7 slaves who were listed as members of the Lexington Minutemen, and why that seems like a kind of an odd situation, but that's the way it was. Right. There were a total of 9 black men in the company. 2 of them were free, but 7 were slaves, and Estabrook was a slave.
Blacks didn't just play a small part in the war. They were in every regiment and militia. They were at Lexington, they were at Concord. More than 100 fought at Bunker Hill. They fought at Boston and New York. There were even blacks on board George Washington's boat as it crossed the Delaware. Over the course of the war, thousands upon thousands of Africans and Indians fought for America's freedom in every battle of the Revolution. But we can only guess exactly why these patriots of color fought for the very people who enslaved them. We can only surmise what motivated them to take up arms beside their oppressors.
One of the reasons that happened a number of instances throughout the war, slave owners, in order to fulfill their requirements, sent slaves in their place. Because in those times, if you were an able-bodied in between 16 and 60, you were part of the militia. It wasn't voluntary. You were part of the militia. Now, it very well could be that they sent these people to take their place. And the only other possibility I can think of is that maybe they felt that if we fight for these people, they'll end up giving us our freedom. So those are the only 2 reasons I've been able to come up with of why they would go out and fight.
So when 77 men under the command of Captain Parker gathered on Lexington Green in the early dawn hours of April 19, 1775, among them was Prince Estabrook, a slave who was armed and ready to fight. And before the sun had shown itself in the sky on that fateful morning, Prince Estabrook would give his blood for the cause of American liberty.
He was part of one of those 77 men, and when the battle started, he got wounded. When we do the reenactment, every year I get wounded in the left shoulder. Gloriously, but I go down.
But what's most notable about Prince Estabrook is not that he was a slave or that he fought in the Revolution, and there were thousands of other men who did that. Prince Estabrook holds a distinction in American history that can be claimed by no other.
He is the first Afro-American casualty of war.
For generations, history has forgotten Prince Estabrook, as well as the names of thousands of other patriots of color who fought, bled, and even died for freedom. Many of their stories have been lost forever.
Very selectively, these people were kind of erased, wiped right out. And it was by, certainly, it's racial prejudice. And they would very much like to forget that that was the case. And I think Prince Estabrook's role might have been forgotten, except for one thing. He got wounded. And the powers that be at the time, in order to make this battle here look as bad as possible, they needed every single name of everybody wounded and killed. And so he was one of the wounded, and so it got recorded that way, because you figure only a third of the people were for this fighting. 2/3 of the people were not for it. And so in order to make the case look as powerful as possible, they had to record everybody that was injured or killed. Their role in history has been downplayed for a long time. Downplayed so much that when people hear about them, they're surprised. I get any number of people surprised that there was a man of color out here on the green. They say, well, that's kind of awkward. They just don't realize that happened because the information has been suppressed so effectively and for so long that in people's minds it just never happened.
In addition to Lexington, Prince Estabrook also fought at Bunker Hill, Fort Ticonderoga, and he guarded prisoners from the Battle of Saratoga. He also spent several more years serving in the Continental Army.
His last enlistment was in October of 1783, so he was involved all throughout the war years.
We don't know much about David Lamson. In some documents, he's listed as being an Indian, in others, a mulatto. But we know for sure that he was a man of color. We also know he had a tremendous amount of experience as a soldier in the French and Indian War. And on April 19, 1775, a roughly 35-year-old David Lamson was right here in Menotomy. And on that fateful day, while Lieutenant Colonel Smith and his men were battling the colonial militias at Lexington and Concord, British reinforcements were dispatched from Boston under the command of Brigadier General Earl Percy.
Lieutenant Colonel Smith had in fact taken prisoners before he got into Lexington Center. And one of the prisoners said, "We have 1,000 men waiting for you on the green." And he didn't really know whether that was true or not. So not taking any chances, he sent for reinforcements in Boston to General Gage. So based on this, Lord Percy was a selected person that was going to take 2 supply wagons, 1,000 men, and 2 cannons from Boston through our little village of Menotomy onto Lexington and for support.
Lord Percy, his cannons, his men, and the supplies wound their way from Boston and through relatively friendly Loyalist territory until eventually reaching the Great Bridge.
It was here that Lord Percy ran into a little problem. The colonists had removed planks from the bridge and stacked them on the opposite side. There was still enough of a bridge to get his troops and his cannons across, but not the horses and wagons for the supply convoy.
So after the main column crossed over, the supply train had to replace the planks in order to cross the river, so they were delayed approximately a half an hour to 45 minutes.
That delay was enough to separate the supply convoy from Lord Percy's troops. Percy marched with 1,000 men that day, and only a very small number ended up escorting the supplies. Word quickly reached Menotomy that the supply convoy was lightly guarded and about to pass through the center of the village. But the people of Menotomy had one problem. All their young, able-bodied men were already off fighting in the militia at Lexington and Concord. Who would take up arms against the king's guards and seize the supply train?
A group of exempts, in other words, people too old for service in the militia, decided they wanted to capture the supply train, which was being escorted by 18 British grenadiers, the cream of the British Army.
And so these old men, these exempts, immediately assembled at Cooper's Tavern. There they formulated a plan to capture the supplies.
They elected a gentleman called David Lamson to be their leader.
They actually selected a David Lamson.
David Lamson was a free man of color. He had served in one of the British regiments stationed in the Caribbean and had come up here during the French and Indian War and gained his independence by serving in the British Army.
They recognized that he must have been a great military man, or at least had the experience that he's better experienced to lead in this particular situation. It had to, at least in my opinion, to be something like that.
And they elected him because of his military experience to lead them.
Today, where the First Unitarian or First Parish Church is in Arlington Center, across from that was a mound of fieldstone and dirt, in which they selected that would be a good point to capture the wagon trains. It was fairly high ground there. They had pretty good cover and wouldn't be seen.
And as the British column drew abreast of it, they popped up.
Lamson popped up along with the other men and ordered them to stop, in which they didn't.
They refused to, and they fired on them, killing 3 outright and wounding several, a couple mortally.
Shots were fired. Actually, horses were killed. A few men were in fact killed.
And they captured the supply train.
A group of 10 old men, led by a free man of color, had unleashed a brilliant ploy against His Majesty's troops. By making their leader the 35-year-old mulatto, likely an imposing presence to the British troops, and also by taking up hidden positions, they were able to fool the convoy into believing their numbers were larger and more youthful. In all, the 11 old men of Menotomy had overtaken 18 professionally trained British soldiers. After the initial shooting, 9 of the grenadiers immediately surrendered and were taken prisoner, and another 6 ran away.
And we believe that it was for the fear of their lives at this point. All of a sudden, and they didn't have a chance to see any numbers, they didn't know whether there was 100, 10, 15, or whatever, when in fact it was close to 11 men.
So these 6 grenadiers, strangers in a hostile land and running for their lives, came upon an old servant woman named Mother Batherick.
She was there actually picking and collecting dandelions, which was used in salads and foods and wines of the day. Also, by her side, she happened to have a musket, which, interestingly enough, there were ducks and game in this particular area, being a pond and everything. So she was there, not knowing what was going on or anything, and all of a sudden had these 6 men running towards her. 5 of them threw their weapons, their muskets, into Spy Pond, and one of them actually broke them over some stone there so that they wouldn't be used by the townspeople. They immediately surrendered to her. She, in the Spring Valley area of the Spy Pond, marched them down the road to what is now Belmont, down Pleasant Street, and from Frost's house, and turned them over.
Mother Batherick told those grenadiers, "If you ever live to get back, you tell King George that an old woman took 6 of his grenadiers prisoner." And word did get back to London. The whole affair was an embarrassment for King George. British opposition papers spread the story and asked Londoners a single rhetorical question.
If one little old lady captured 6 grenadiers, what would it take to win the war?
And so the village of Menotomy had the first capture of the war.
This is important, and probably the most important thing of the day, event of the day, simply because all of the relief supplies for the original column were in this supply train. Ammunition, food, plus the ammunition for the 2 cannons that Lord Percy had with him.
Lord Percy set up headquarters here at Monroe Tavern in Lexington and awaited his supplies with great anticipation.
But his stay here was short-lived. After only an hour and a half, Lord Percy made the decision to retreat back to Boston. Had his supply convoy arrived, it might have been a different story.
They were unable to go on the offensive and had to fight a defensive battle back to Boston. Had he had his supply train, they would have had enough ammunition to go on the offensive. So this turned the tide of the day towards the colonists and turned the British retreat into a rout.
But it was the surprise of the day, just, again, old men of the village that just surprised the British soldiers.
But fearing the British soldiers upon their retreat would recognize the dead horses, the people of Menotomy dragged their corpses to this spot along the shore of Spy Pond.
For generations, the horse bones lay here, bleaching in the sun. They were such a curiosity that for almost a century, the old bones were visited by the children and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of the people who were there that day back in 1775. Of course, the old horse bones are long gone now, but it shouldn't stop people from remembering this great event in our history. David Lamson and the old men of Menotomy had not only beaten the Grenadiers, they had all but sealed victory for Middlesex County over the British that day.
Living old men led by a black man. And in those days, the connotation that went with it, blacks were considered inferior. And here we have a man who, on his own, freely of his own will, joined up to fight against the British. Joined the fight. He had many reasons not to.
These men weren't really afraid. When the time came, they really came through.
Go and ask somebody who Prince Estabrook is. Nobody knows, unless they happen to live in Lexington. And Prince Estabrook, again, another African American, he was wounded on April 19th. He fought at Bunker Hill. But nobody knows about Prince Estabrook.
I think more and more we're trying to bring them forward and trying to get recognition.
You wonder, it took a lot of, gumption to get in there and put up with the hardships that they faced.
We're giving tribute where tribute belongs.
Always keep in the back of your mind that these people, they must have had a goal in mind, freedom.
For further reading about Prince Estabrook, look for Prince Estabrook, Slave and Soldier by Alice Hinkle. If you want to know more about David Lamson, read Samuel Abbott Smith's West Cambridge, 1775. Also, you can contact the Arlington Historical Society.